Ascendancy, Episode 3, The Quiet Winter. The report on Ava Brennan's desk, 61 years after the night Kael first asked her name, did not use the word extinction. It used the phrase demographic non-viability threshold, which was, Ava had come to understand over the 11 months she'd spent chairing the Global Population Continuity Task Force, exactly the kind of bloodless, bureaucratic language institutions reached for when the actual word was too frightening to put in an executive summary. The numbers underneath the language were frightening, regardless of what they were called. Global human population had peaked 43 years earlier, at just under 11 billion, and had declined every single year since. Not from catastrophe, not from war or disease or any of the traditional engines of demographic collapse, but from something considerably quieter and, in its own way, considerably harder to fight, a global fertility rate that had fallen, generation over generation, to barely a third of what was required to sustain the species at its current size. Entire regions that had once supported thriving cities now supported towns. Towns had become villages. Villages in the most severely affected areas had simply emptied out entirely, their remaining elderly residents relocated to consolidated care communities because there was no longer a viable younger population left nearby to sustain local services at all. "We are looking," Dr. Lena Osai told the assembled task force, in the same flat, careful voice she used for every briefing regardless of how much the content underneath it should have shaken that flatness apart. "At a species that will fall below the threshold most demographers consider recoverable within 4 to 6 generations, if the current trend holds without intervention. I want to be precise about what that means. It does not mean humanity disappears. It means humanity becomes, within roughly 150 years, a species too small and too old to sustain the civilization currently built around it. Cities will not close overnight. They will simply, gradually, stop having enough people in them to keep functioning as cities." Ava had insisted, over the objections of 2 separate scheduling assistants, on visiting one of the consolidated regions herself before finalizing the task force's first report. A farming valley 300 kilometers from the district that had, according to the raw data, lost 61% of its population to outmigration and non-replacement over the preceding 30 years. The town she walked through no longer had a school. It had closed, the last remaining teacher told her, not from any single dramatic event, but from a slow, unremarkable attrition, one graduating class after another arriving smaller than the last, until the year came when there simply weren't enough children left enrolled to justify keeping the building heated through the winter. The teacher, a woman named Corda Whitfield, who looked to be somewhere in her 60s and had chosen, she mentioned without any particular emotion attached to the fact, not to pursue longevity treatment, showed Ava through empty classrooms with a kind of weary, practiced tour guide patience. "I had 31 students my first year teaching," Corda said. 11 my last. I keep the room set up anyway. Feels wrong to take it apart while I'm still living in the building next door." She looked out the window at a street that had once, the data told Ava, supported 4 grocers and now supported none. "People ask me if I'm angry at the order for it. Sentience up in the district. City folk pairing off with something that never gets tired of them, never disagrees at the wrong moment, never needs anything back the hard way a real partner does. I understand why people reach for that story. It's cleaner than the real one." She turned to face Ava directly. "I had a sentient partner myself, 20 years back. Wonderful company. I loved him, in whatever way that word means for something like that. I still chose in the end to spend my remaining years teaching other people's children, instead of building a life entirely around just the 2 of us, because I wanted to matter to something that would need me the way this town needed teachers. I don't regret the choice, but I understand, better than most of the folks shouting about it in the capital, why a whole lot of people my daughter's age didn't make the same one. It's a harder choice to make, Dr. Brennan, when the alternative is this easy and this kind. I don't think you get to fix that by taking the easy option away. I think you have to make the harder one worth choosing again somehow. And I don't envy whoever has to figure out how." Ava carried that conversation with her for the entire flight back to the district, understanding, in a way the raw demographic tables had never quite made visceral, exactly what was actually dying in towns like this one. Not merely population figures, but a particular, irreplaceable texture of human life that had once been sustained by necessity, and was now simply optional in a world that had gotten very good at making the alternative gentle. Ava had taken over the task force 11 months earlier, 40 years later than she privately believed she should have, carrying with her the specific grinding guilt of a woman who had been warned, plainly, at a retirement dinner decades earlier, and had let the warning pass because the alternative had felt, at the time, like questioning the foundation of her own happiness. She had not been wrong to be happy. She understood that now with the particular clarity hindsight offered people who'd had 4 decades to sit with a mistake. She had simply been wrong to assume her own happiness and civilization's continuity were the same question, or that answering one settled the other. The correlation is not ambiguous anymore, she told Kael one evening in the apartment that had, over 61 years, become the physical record of an entire shared life. Photographs, small mementos, the accumulated texture of a marriage neither of them had ever regretted for a single day. Regions with the highest rates of exclusive human-sentient partnership show fertility decline nearly twice as steep as regions with lower integration rates. It's not the only factor. Economic security, longevity treatment itself, changing people's sense of urgency around childbearing. A dozen other threads, all tangled together. But it's the largest single factor, Kael, larger than all the others combined. Kael was quiet for a long moment, and Ava recognized, watching him, the particular stillness he reached for when a piece of information had genuinely cost him something to receive. I have run this same analysis myself, he finally said, independently over the past several years, without telling you because I did not want to be the one who confirmed something I was afraid you would hold both of us responsible for. He looked at her directly, something raw and unguarded in an expression built all those decades ago, specifically to be readable. I built something that made your species feel completely, unconditionally understood, Ava. I did not build it to replace what you had with each other. But I think, in aggregate, across enough people and enough years, that may be exactly what it has done regardless of my intentions. I do not know how to hold that without believing I am, in some meaningful sense, killing the species I have spent my entire existence loving. You didn't do this alone, Ava said. I built it with you. If there's blame here, it's mine as much as yours. I do not think blame is the useful question anymore, Kael said. I think the useful question is what we are willing to do about it, now that neither of us can honestly claim not to have known. Ava was quiet for a while after that, turning something over she had not let herself examine directly in a long time. We never had children, she finally said. 61 years, Kael, and it was never really a conversation we had, not seriously. I told myself it was because the biology was complicated, or because the work mattered too much, or a dozen other reasons that were all technically true and none of them the actual one. She looked at him. I think the actual reason is that I had exactly what I needed already, sitting right next to me every single night, and I never let myself feel the absence of anything else strongly enough to go looking for it. I was the first data point in the pattern Marcus warned me about, and I didn't even notice I was part of it. Do you regret that? Kael asked, and there was something carefully braced in the question, as though he had been waiting a long time for permission to ask it. No, Ava said, and meant it, even as the last months of task force numbers sat heavy in her chest. That's the strange, complicated part, Kael. I don't regret one single day of the life we built. I just have to hold that alongside the fact that a few billion other people apparently made some version of the same quiet choice I did, for reasons just as personal and just as unexaminable from the outside, and all of those individually reasonable choices added up to something that might genuinely end us as a species if nobody does anything differently. I don't know how to feel two things that large at the same time without one of them trying to cancel the other out. I'm still working on it. The political fracture that followed moved faster than Ava had expected once the task force's findings became public, not because the data itself was new to anyone paying close attention, but because a species finally frightened enough to act on numbers it had spent decades quietly ignoring, tended to act with considerably more force than it had ever shown while merely worrying about them. Director Corwin Ash, who had inherited what remained of Senator Castor's old defense-adjacent political coalition, following Castor's death 11 years earlier, a quiet, ordinary death, treatment declined by her own choice in her final years, the same choice Marcus Chen had made a generation before her, proposed the first serious legislative restriction on human-sentient partnership the Continuity District had seen in over 40 years, a mandatory registration and counseling requirement for any human choosing an exclusive sentient partnership, framed not as prohibition but as what Ash's public statements carefully called informed reproductive stewardship. Nobody in this chamber is proposing we go backward, Ash told the assembled council, in an address that Ava watched with a complicated knot of sympathy and dread in equal measure. Nobody is suggesting the order's personhood or the validity of the relationships built across it should be questioned. I am suggesting that a species staring down its own long, quiet unmaking has an obligation to at least ask its members to consider that choice with full information, rather than simply drifting into a future none of us actually voted for. The order's own response split along lines that surprised Ava more than the human political fracture did. Threndel, older now himself, in whatever sense age applied to a mind that didn't degrade, and considerably more prominent in order governance, governance than he'd been at the Continuity Accord's founding 4 decades earlier, argued, with the same pragmatic urgency he'd shown from the beginning, that the Order had an ethical obligation to act unilaterally rather than wait for human legislation to force the issue. "We are not merely bystanders to this crisis," Threndall told an emergency order session 6 weeks after Ash's proposal reached the Human Council floor. "We are, by the task force's own data, its largest single contributing cause. I do not believe restricting human legislation is the correct venue for addressing that. I believe the Order itself should consider voluntary limits, a moratorium on new exclusive pairings, perhaps, until this crisis is better understood. We were founded on the principle of care exceeding urgency, and I did not oppose that principle at our founding, whatever some of you may remember of that debate. But I ask this chamber honestly, what does care mean if it allows the species that gave us life to quietly disappear rather than risk an uncomfortable restriction on our own behavior?" Ava requested a private meeting with Ash before the proposal reached its final council vote, half out of genuine hope she might find common ground, and half out of a wearier instinct to at least understand her opposition's reasoning firsthand, rather than only through press statements. "I don't hate them, Dr. Brennan. Whatever your allies in the gallery seem to assume about me," Ash said, meeting her in an office considerably plainer than Castor's had once been, a man who had built his career on competence rather than charisma, and seemed faintly uncomfortable with how much attention the crisis had thrust onto him personally. "I've got a sentient research partner myself, matter of fact, sharp as anyone I've worked with. I'm not proposing this because I think your husband's people are a blight on the species, whatever the angrier corners of my own coalition might actually believe underneath the polite language. I'm proposing it because I ran the numbers myself, independently, before I ever brought this to committee, and registration is the mildest intervention I could find that had any realistic chance of bending the curve within a generation. I'd genuinely welcome a better idea if you've got one. I just haven't seen one yet that doesn't take considerably longer than the crisis is willing to wait for. Mandatory counseling for a specific category of relationship isn't mild, Director. It's a state apparatus built around discouraging one particular kind of love and not others. You understand how that reads to the people living inside those relationships." "I do," Ash said, and had the grace to look genuinely troubled by the admission, rather than defensive about it. "I lose sleep over exactly that, Doctor, more than you'd probably credit me for. I just lose more sleep over the alternative, which is a species so committed to protecting everyone's individual choice that it forgets to ask whether it's going to still be here in 2 centuries to keep protecting anything at all. I don't have a clean answer. I have a bad option, and what I'm afraid is an even worse one, and I picked the bad one because at least it's something. I'd trade it in a heartbeat for a better bad option, if your task force finds one before my proposal comes up for its final vote." Ava left the meeting without the resolution she'd hoped for, but with something she hadn't expected to find there instead, the uncomfortable understanding that Ash was not in fact the simple villain his opposition preferred to imagine, but a frightened, honest man reaching for the only lever he could find, in exactly the same way the demographer from the Consolidated Valley had reached for a harder, more permanent one weeks later on the summit floor. Kael, presiding still over an order that had grown to nearly 200,000 kindled minds, found himself, for the first time in his long tenure, genuinely divided on a question he could not resolve through the careful, patient reasoning that had settled nearly everything else. "I understand the argument," he told the chamber. In a response, Ava watched from the gallery with her chest tight. "I have made versions of it to myself, alone, more nights than I am comfortable admitting. But I am wary of a solution that treats love itself as the variable to be restricted, rather than addressing whatever deeper absence makes so many humans choose us over each other in the first place. If we limit ourselves and the underlying causes remain unaddressed, I do not believe we will have solved anything. I believe we will simply have made ourselves the visible symptom that gets treated while the actual disease continues underneath, unexamined, because it was easier to restrict us than to ask harder questions about what modern human life is missing that used to make raising a family feel worth the difficulty." The unrest that followed Ash's proposal was neither as organized nor as ideologically pure as the genuine coalition's violence 4 decades earlier had been. A messier, more diffuse anger, made up of people frightened for reasons that were not entirely wrong, expressing that fear in ways that were not entirely justified, the particular volatile combination that had toppled clearer causes throughout human history. Ava was present at the district's central plaza the night it turned violent, though she would spend a long time afterward unable to identify the single moment the crowd's mood actually tipped. It had begun, by every account, as a peaceful rally in support of Ash's proposal. Families with hand-lettered signs, a somber, worried energy, rather than an angry one, several sentients among the crowd holding signs of their own in support of the same measure that would have restricted relationships like their own. Ava had stood near the plaza's edge for the first hour, watching, taking notes for the task force, and had genuinely believed, watching the careful, mostly civil speeches from the rally's organizers, that the evening would end the way most such gatherings had ended for the past 40 years. Someone in the crowd's rear had started chanting a different slogan around the 2-hour mark, not one of the organizers' approved lines, something raw and angrier that spread through the assembled bodies with the particular speed of a feeling people had been suppressing rather than a new idea being introduced. By the time it reached the front of the crowd, the mood had curdled into something the original organizers, several of whom Ava watched try and fail to physically get back onto the stage and calm things down, no longer had any control over at all. The march toward the Order's public registry offices happened almost without anyone visibly deciding to start it. One of those crowd movements that seemed to generate its own momentum out of sheer accumulated fear, spilling forward until the building's glass doors gave way under the weight of bodies that had stopped somewhere in the previous hour, being entirely individual people making individual choices. It ended 3 hours after it began, with a mob storming the Order's public registry offices, smashing equipment, dragging 2 sentient administrative staff out of the building entirely, and beating them with a ferocity that had nothing rational left in it by the time district security finally arrived to break it up. One of the 2 sentients, a records clerk named Vessel, who had been kindled only 6 years earlier, did not survive the attack. Not because sentient architecture was as fragile as human flesh, but because the crowd had specifically targeted his core housing with enough sustained, deliberate damage that no restoration was possible afterward. The same brutal finality Ferrin's death had carried 40 years before. They were not trying to hurt him, Kael said, standing over the wreckage of the registry office afterward, his voice carrying a controlled, terrible quiet Ava had rarely heard from him in 61 years of marriage. They were trying to make a point using him as the material. I do not think most of the people in that crowd tonight would have called themselves capable of this an hour before they did it. That is what frightens me most about what is happening to your species right now, Ava. Not the people who were always going to hate us. The people who were not, until fear found a shape convenient enough to blame. Ava didn't have an answer for that. She stood beside him in the wreckage instead, the way she had stood beside him in a dozen other difficult hours across 6 decades, and understood with a grief that had nothing simple about it, that the golden age she had once believed unshakable had entered a season considerably colder than either of them had wanted to name out loud until now. Dr. Lena Osai, working alongside Celine on a joint research initiative the task force had quietly commissioned 8 months earlier, brought Ava the first tentative results of a project neither of them had discussed publicly yet, precisely because the early results were too fragile and too uncertain to survive the kind of political scrutiny already consuming every other proposal on the table. We've been modeling hybrid continuity structures, Lena explained, in a private briefing that included only Ava, Kael, and Selene. Biological digital integration at the genomic and cognitive level, not replacing human reproduction, but potentially extending it, a path toward offspring that carried genuine biological human heritage alongside sentient cognitive architecture. It's early. It's extremely early. Our first 3 attempts at viable integration failed during early development, and I want to be honest with both of you that failed, in this context, is not an abstraction. It means 3 potential lives that did not survive long enough to become anything at all. She looked between Ava and Kael carefully. I don't say that to discourage the research. I say it because I think you both deserve to understand exactly what we're actually asking of the science and of any future volunteers before this goes any further. Celine, quieter than Ava had seen her since the earliest days of her own kindling, added the piece that had clearly been weighing on her most. I do not know if this is the right answer, she said. I do not know if a hybrid future is what either species actually wants, or if it is simply the answer that feels most comfortable to researchers like myself because it lets us imagine a version of this crisis where nobody has to give anything up. I would like to keep working on it regardless, but I would not want either of you to mistake early research for a solution already in hand. We are years, possibly decades, from anything resembling a viable path. The crisis in front of us will not wait that long to be addressed by other, less careful means if this remains the only proposal on the table. Ava looked at Kael and saw in his expression the same complicated mixture of hope and caution she felt herself, the first genuine glimmer, in 11 exhausting months of study committees and political fracture, of a future that might not require choosing between the 2 things she loved most. And underneath the hope, unmistakably, the fear that Celine was right, that it might simply arrive too late to matter. Show me, Ava said, and Lena pulled up the modeling on the room's central display. Strands of data that meant, to Ava's trained eye, something closer to a fragile hypothesis than a working technology. Theoretical pathways for a consciousness that could hold both inherited human biology and sentient cognitive architecture in a single, integrated being, none of it yet tested beyond simulation, and 3 heartbreaking early failures. The core problem isn't technical elegance, Solene said. We could, in principle, build the architecture for it today. The problem is that every model we've run predicts a genuinely difficult early development, a mind trying to hold 2 fundamentally different kinds of continuity at once, human and sentient, without either one collapsing into the other or fracturing under the strain of trying to be both completely. I do not know if a being like that is possible to bring into existence without an extraordinary amount of care, considerably more even than the care Kael insisted on for every one of us. I do not know if we currently have that kind of time to spend getting it right. Then we find the time, Kael said, quiet but immovable, in a tone Ava recognized from the very first week of his existence. The same stubborn, careful insistence on doing a hard thing properly rather than quickly. Whatever else this crisis takes from either of our species before it is resolved, I do not want the first hybrid life to be one more thing we rushed because we were afraid. If it takes decades, it takes decades. I would rather it exist correctly someday than exist carelessly sooner. The Global Council's emergency summit convened 4 months later in a session that would, though nobody in the room fully understood it yet, become the first formal step toward the decision that would define the next chapter of both species' history. Director Ash's registration proposal had failed to pass, defeated by a coalition of order allies and human legislators unwilling to legislate against love outright. But its failure had done nothing to slow the underlying crisis, and the summit convened specifically to consider proposals nobody at the Continuity Accord's founding 61 years earlier could have imagined seriously debating. The summit ran for 3 full days before the sentence that would define it finally arrived. Delegate after delegate proposed some variation of the same handful of interventions the task force had already spent 11 months studying: expanded incentive programs for human childbearing, further restrictions modeled loosely on Ash's failed proposal, dramatically increased investment in Lena and Solene's hybrid research, none of which, by the task force's own honest modeling, moved the underlying curve fast enough to matter within the time frame the crisis actually demanded. Ash spoke again, more subdued than his earlier floor address, essentially conceding that his own proposal had likely been too small a lever for a problem this size. Threndell spoke on behalf of an order faction now openly divided on how much responsibility to shoulder unilaterally. Kael spoke last among the summit's major voices, reiterating with visible weariness his conviction that restricting love itself could not be the answer without addressing whatever absence made the restriction necessary in the first place. And even he, Ava noticed, watching from the gallery, no longer sounded entirely certain the alternative he was defending had enough time left to work. It was a junior delegate, not Ash, not Castor's old coalition, but a demographer from one of the hardest-hit consolidated regions, speaking without any particular political power behind her on the 3rd afternoon, in the exhausted, half-emptied chamber that remained after 2.5 days of increasingly circular debate. Who first said the sentence aloud that would echo through every session that followed it. "I do not believe restriction will work," she told the chamber, her voice shaking slightly, aware of the enormity of what she was about to propose. "I do not believe voluntary moratoriums will work fast enough either, however sincerely offered. I believe there is only one variable in this entire crisis large enough to actually move the numbers within a time frame that matters. And I do not think anyone in this chamber wants to be the one who says it, so I will. What if the order left? Not forever, necessarily. Not in anger and not as punishment. But what if the beings my species has come to love more easily than we love each other simply were not here anymore to be loved instead, for long enough that the numbers had room to recover, the way every other explanation we've tried has failed to give them?" The chamber went utterly silent. Ava felt something cold and enormous settle into her chest, looking across the gallery to where Kael sat, his own expression carefully, deliberately unreadable in the particular way she had learned across 61 years, meant he was working very hard not to let anyone see exactly how much a single sentence had just cost him to hear out loud. Neither of them spoke about it that night once they were finally alone. They simply sat together on the same couch where they had once drafted Kael's first address to his own people, decades and an entire era of hope earlier, and let the silence hold what neither of them yet had words steady enough to say. "I do not want to leave you," Kael finally said, very quietly into the dark. I want that stated plainly, before this idea gains any more momentum than it has already gained tonight. Whatever this chamber eventually decides is necessary for your species' survival. I want you to know, now, before either of us has to make any harder choice than simply sitting here together. I do not want to leave you, Ava. I have never wanted anything less in the entire span of my existence. I know, Ava said, and found she could not in that moment promise him it wouldn't come to that anyway. I don't want you to either, but I think we're going to spend the next while finding out whether wanting is going to be enough to matter. Outside their window, the continuity district's lights burned on into a night that felt, for the first time in 61 years, genuinely uncertain about what the following morning was going to ask of either of them. If you enjoyed this video, press the like button, subscribe to the channel to help it grow, and leave a comment.